All right, let's look at some of these problems from the textbook. This is chapter 2.4, problems 103 and 104. These are chain rule problems that involve applying the chain rule correctly and being able to use the graph to identify parts that are required to find the solution. Okay, so exercise 103 and 104, the graphs of f and g are shown. Okay, let h of x equal to f of g of x, and let s of x equal to g of f of x. Find each derivative if it exists. If the derivative does not exist, explain why. So 103 says find h prime of 1. So if we want to find h prime of 1, we look to see what h of x gives us. H of x is f of g of x. So this is a two-step process. We first need to identify what h prime of x is, and then we can find h prime of 1. So if we want to find h prime of x, f of g of x, it's a composite function, we have to involve chain rule. So chain rule says to apply the outer function's derivative, then multiply by the inner or inside function's derivative. So let's apply chain rule to find h prime. So h prime is equal to the outer function's derivative. So that's f. So f prime of g of x times the inside function derivative times g prime. Okay, next step, we want to evaluate h prime of 1. So we're going to replace every x that we see with 1. So h prime of 1 would be equal to f prime of g of 1 times g prime of 1. All right, so one step at a time. Before we can evaluate g prime of f prime of g of 1, we need to first know what g of 1 is. So we're going to go to our graph to identify g of 1. So g of 1, if we look at our graph here, g of 1 is equal to 4. So g of 1 is equal to 4. We'll replace g of 1 with 4. So now we're left with f prime of 4 times, and then g prime of 1. G prime of 1 is simply asking for the slope of the graph for g function at 1. So here's the graph of g. The slope of this graph at 1 is going to be whatever the slope of this line is. Okay? And then the slope of this line, we can just choose 2 points on this line segment, and we just find a slope. So from this point to this point, we can say down 1 over 2. So the slope is negative 1 over 2. So g prime of 1 is negative 1/2. So f prime of 4 times g prime of 1, which is negative 1/2. And then we can continue with the problem. We found g of 1 is 4, so now we can find f prime of 4. So now it's asking for what is the graph of the f graph when x is 4. So here is our f graph. At 4, we want to find the slope of the graph at this point. Okay, so this is part of a straight line, so we can find the slope of this graph at this point. We'll have a slope of negative 1, right? If we choose 2 points on this line segment, down 1 over 1, so negative 1. So f prime of 4 gets replaced with negative 1. Negative 1/2 stays negative 1/2, so negative 1 times negative 1/2 is positive 1/2. Okay, find s prime of 5. So s prime of 5 would mean for us to find, we need to first identify what s prime of x is. So s prime of x, we have to go through quotient rule again. So outer function's derivative, so g prime of f of x times the inside function's derivative times f prime. So same steps as before. We're going to replace every x we see with 5 because we want to evaluate s prime of 5. So replace every x with 5. So now we can further evaluate using our graph. F of 5. So f of 5 we see is at 6. So f of 5 gets replaced with 6. And then f prime of 5 would be asking for the slope of the f graph at 5. So the slope of the f graph at 5 is at this point, and this point has a slope of negative 1, so down 1 over 1. Okay? And then we have found what f of 5 is, so we can further evaluate the problem. So g prime of 6 is asking for the slope of the g graph at 6. So the slope of the g graph at 6 would be at this point. However, that point there's a sudden change in slope, right? Slope is 0 on one side, and then it changes to a slope of -1/2. So what we can say is the slope does not exist at that particular point, okay? Because on either side of that point, it's also part of a sharp point. So sharp point here, a sudden change is not a smooth curve. The slope does not exist. So since g prime of 6 does not exist, we can't continue evaluating the s prime of 5. So we'll have to bring down the fact that since g prime of 6 does not exist, s prime of 5 also does not exist. Hey, 104. 104, these are actually going to be, I adjusted the problem here, where I want us to practice using product rule and chain rule. So I've defined h of x to be f of x times g of x, and s of x to be f of x divided by g of x. Okay, so I made a slight change for problem 104. All right, for 104, we want to find h prime of 3. So before we can find h prime of 3, we need to evaluate h prime of x. So to find h prime of x, we see that f of x and g of x are related to one another by product. So we have to go through product rule. They're being multiplied together. So to evaluate the derivative of two functions being multiplied together, we have to go through product rule. So f prime g plus fg prime. So that's our first step. We're going to use the rule to evaluate the derivative. Next step, replace every x we see with 3. So here, replace every x we see with 3, and then we can look use the graph to either look for the ordered pair y value or to look for the slope of the graph at that point. All right, so first thing here, f prime of 3. So f prime of 3 is asking for what is the slope of the f graph at 3. So the slope of the f graph, here's the f graph is the one that slopes downward and then moves up. So slope at 3 would be at this point, and at this point we can choose 2 points on this line segment. I'll choose the point at 2 and 4. So to get from one point to another going through slope, I go up 1 over 2, so slope of 1/2. So f prime of 3 is 1/2. G of 3 is simply asking for the y value of the g graph at 3. So the g graph starts up here. So g of 3 would be at that point. So that point is at 5. So we have g of 3 gets replaced with 5. F of 3 at the f graph at 3. So the f graph at 3, the f graph goes down here, is at 1/2. So that point here, 1/2. And then g prime of 3. So g prime of 3 is the slope of the g graph at that point. So if I choose 2 points here, I go up 1 over 1. The slope is 1. So I have 1/2 times 5 plus 1/2 times 1. So 5 over 2 plus 1 over 2 is 6 over 2, which is 3. All right, last one here to find finding s prime of 9. So before we can find s prime of 9, we need to evaluate s prime of x. So to find s prime of x, we have to, in this case, go through quotient rule. So quotient rule says f prime times g minus fg prime all over g squared. Replace every x we see with 9. So now we can use our graph. F prime of 9, so f prime of 9. So here's the f graph. F prime of 9 is asking for the slope of the f graph at that point. And if we choose 2 points on this graph, we see that it is a slope of 2, up 2 over 1. Okay, so f prime of 9 gets replaced with 2. G of 9 is asking for the y value when g graph has the x value of 9. So g of 9 is equal to 2. So g of 9 gets replaced with 2 minus f of 9. So f of 9 is the y value, which will be at this point, which will be 8. Okay, and then finally g prime of 9. So g prime of 9 is the slope of the g graph at 9. So if I choose 2 points here, down 1 over 1, negative 1. All over g of 9 squared. So g of 9 is 2. So all over 2 squared. So 4 plus 8 over 4. 12 over 4 is 3. So s prime of 9 is equal to 3.